Lieutenant Jake Morrison gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang as he flew through the pre-dawn darkness over occupied France. At 23, he was one of the youngest pilots in the 352nd Fighter Squadron, but what he lacked in experience, he made up for in raw determination and an almost reckless courage that both impressed and worried his commanding officers. The mission briefing had been crystal clear. Intelligence had located a massive ammunition depot hidden in the mountains near the German border. The facility was supplying the entire Wehrmacht division that had been holding up the Allied advance for weeks. Standard bombing runs had failed due to the depot's location in a narrow valley, surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and protected by natural rock formations that made precision bombing nearly impossible. "This is a suicide mission," his wingman Tommy Chen had whispered during the briefing. "They're sending us in alone with these old birds against the entire German air defense network." Jake had just smiled grimly. "Sometimes the old birds are exactly what you need, Tommy. They don't expect a World War I-style attack in 1944. Now, as he flew alone through the darkness, Tommy's engine had failed during takeoff, forcing him to abort. Jake questioned his own bravado. His Mustang, christened Liberty Belle, after his sweetheart back in Kansas, was indeed an older model, one of the early P-51Bs with the older Allison engine instead of the newer Merlin. The aircraft had character, personality, and more importantly, it was quiet enough to slip through enemy patrols undetected. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the French countryside when Jake spotted the valley. Intelligence had been right. It was a natural fortress, carved deep between two mountain ridges with only one narrow entrance. As he descended to get a better look, the scope of the depot became clear. Dozens of reinforced concrete bunkers were scattered throughout the valley floor, connected by a network of tunnels and roads. Trucks moved constantly between the structures, ferrying supplies and ammunition to waiting trains that would carry the deadly cargo to the front lines. Jake circled high above the valley, studying the defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned on every ridge, their barrels scanning the sky like hungry predators. Fighter patrols crisscrossed the airspace in regular patterns, and he counted at least a dozen Messerschmitt Bf 109 providing air cover. The original plan had called for a coordinated attack with Tommy providing distraction while Jake made the bombing run. Now, flying solo, he would have to improvise. Jake checked his payload: 4 500-pound bombs and a full load of .50 caliber ammunition. It wasn't much against such a heavily defended target, but it would have to do. Banking sharply to the left, Jake began his approach from the east, using the rising sun to mask his silhouette. He dropped to barely 50 feet above the treetops, racing through valleys and over ridges at maximum speed. The Allison engine roared with power as he pushed Liberty Belle to her limits. The first sign of trouble came when a German patrol spotted him crossing a river valley. Machine gun tracers lit up the morning sky as ground troops opened fire, and within seconds, radio chatter filled the airwaves as the alarm spread throughout the defensive network. "So much for the element of surprise," Jake muttered, pulling into a steep climb as two Messerschmitts dove toward him from above. The first German fighter came in fast and high, cannon shells exploding around Jake's aircraft as he rolled into a tight spiral dive. The older P-51 might not have been as fast as the newer models, but it was incredibly maneuverable, and Jake used every trick he had learned in flight school to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. Banking hard to the right, he lined up on the second Messerschmitt and squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, sending streams of armor-piercing rounds into the German fighter's engine. Black smoke poured from the aircraft as it rolled over and began a death spiral toward the ground below. But Jake's victory was short-lived. More German fighters were climbing to intercept him, and the anti-aircraft guns throughout the valley had opened up, filling the sky with deadly flak. He needed to complete his mission quickly, or risk being overwhelmed by the defensive response. Diving toward the valley floor, Jake spotted his primary target, a massive concrete bunker near the center of the depot that intelligence had identified as the main ammunition storage facility. If he could destroy that single building, the resulting explosion would likely take out half the depot. At 300 feet above the ground, Jake leveled off and began his bombing run. Flak bursts exploded all around Liberty Belle, shaking the aircraft violently and filling the cockpit with the acrid smell of cordite. A fragment of shrapnel punched through the canopy, just inches from his head, spider-webbing the plexiglass and making it difficult to see. 200 yards from the target, Jake released his first bomb. He watched it arc downward toward the bunker, but at the last second, a gust of wind pushed it off course. The 500-pound bomb exploded against the hillside, sending up a massive cloud of dirt and rock but leaving the bunker untouched. "Damn," Jake cursed, pulling into a steep climb as machine gun fire from the ground position sought to bring him down. He had 3 bombs left and was rapidly running out of time and altitude. Circling back for another run, Jake found himself facing an increasingly desperate situation. 4 Messerschmitts were now actively hunting him, coordinating their attacks to box him into the valley where the anti-aircraft guns could finish him off. Each pass brought them closer to succeeding. But Jake had grown up flying crop dusters on his father's farm in Kansas, threading through power lines and around grain silos at breakneck speed. He knew how to use terrain to his advantage, and the narrow valley that was supposed to be the depot's greatest protection could also work in his favor. Flying barely 20 feet above the valley floor, Jake raced between the ammunition bunkers at maximum speed. The German fighters couldn't follow him at such low altitude without risking collision with the buildings, and the anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to track him effectively. As he flashed past a row of storage buildings, Jake spotted something that made his heart race with excitement. A train was loading at the depot's rail yard, its cars packed with artillery shells and ammunition boxes. If he could hit that train with the right timing, the explosion would be catastrophic. Banking sharply to the left, Jake lined up on the locomotive. This would require precision flying. He would need to drop his remaining bombs in sequence, timing each release perfectly to maximize the damage. At this altitude and speed, he would have only one chance. The first bomb left the aircraft just as Jake flashed over the engine. He immediately pulled into a slight climb and released the second bomb over the ammunition cars. The third bomb went off as he passed over the fuel depot adjacent to the rail yard. For a moment, nothing happened. Jake was already pulling into a steep climb, trying to gain altitude before the German fighters could intercept him again, when the world exploded below him. The first detonation came from the locomotive, a relatively small explosion that derailed the train and scattered burning fuel across the rail yard. But as that fire spread to the ammunition cars, the real fireworks began. Shell after shell cooked off in a thunderous chain reaction that shook the entire valley. The massive explosion at the rail yard triggered a secondary blast in a nearby ammunition bunker, which in turn set off another bunker, and then another. Within minutes, the entire depot was consumed in a series of interconnected explosions that could be seen from 50 miles away. The blast wave was so powerful that it shattered windows in villages throughout the region and triggered landslides on both sides of the valley. Jake felt Liberty Belle buckling and shaking as the shock waves reached his altitude. The German fighters that had been pursuing him were scattered by the blast, their pilots struggling to maintain control as their aircraft were tossed around like leaves in a hurricane. But Jake's celebration was premature. As he leveled off and tried to assess the damage below, he realized that his aircraft had taken more hits than he initially thought. The engine was running rough, losing power with each passing minute. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and he could see a thin stream of coolant leaking from the radiator. Liberty Belle was dying, and Jake was still deep in enemy territory, with nearly 200 miles of occupied France between him and the Allied lines. Fighting to maintain altitude, Jake turned west toward home. The engine continued to deteriorate, forcing him to reduce power and lose precious altitude. German patrols would be swarming the area soon, searching for the pilot who had just destroyed their most important supply depot. At 15,000 feet, the engine finally gave up completely. The prop windmilled uselessly as Liberty Belle began a long glide toward the French countryside below. Jake had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time left before he would be forced to crash land in enemy territory. Scanning the ground below, he searched desperately for a suitable landing site. The terrain was heavily forested, broken by small farms and villages, most of which were likely crawling with German troops. He needed an open field long enough to accommodate a dead-stick landing, preferably somewhere away from main roads where he might have a chance to evade capture. At 5,000 feet, Jake spotted his opportunity, a long, narrow meadow beside a small stream, surrounded by dense woods that would provide cover. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best option. Dropping the landing gear and extending the flaps, Jake lined up for his final approach. Without engine power, he would have only one chance to get this right. Too steep and he would crash into the trees at the far end of the field. Too shallow, and he wouldn't make it to the meadow at all. Liberty Belle touched down hard, bouncing twice before settling onto the rough grass. Jake fought to keep the aircraft straight as it rolled across the uneven ground, finally coming to rest less than 50 yards from the tree line. For a moment, Jake sat in the cockpit, hardly believing he was still alive. The explosion at the ammunition depot had been spectacular beyond his wildest expectations. Intelligence would later estimate that he had destroyed enough ammunition to supply an entire German division for 3 months. But now the real challenge began, surviving behind enemy lines and making it back to Allied territory. Grabbing his survival kit and emergency radio, Jake climbed out of the cockpit and began the process of destroying anything that might be useful to the enemy. He opened the fuel drains and scattered survival rations around the aircraft, then used a thermite grenade to destroy the radio and instruments. As smoke began rising from Liberty Belle's cockpit, Jake heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. German search teams were already closing in on his location. He would need to move fast if he wanted to avoid capture. Slinging his survival pack over his shoulder, Jake disappeared into the forest just as the first German patrol vehicle appeared at the edge of the meadow. Behind him, his faithful aircraft burned like a funeral pyre, marking the end of one chapter of his story and the beginning of another. The next 3 days would test every survival skill Jake had ever learned. Moving only at night and hiding during the day, he made his way westward through forests and fields, avoiding German patrols and sympathetic French civilians alike. His emergency radio had limited range, and he couldn't risk transmission until he was much closer to Allied lines. On the fourth night, exhausted and nearly out of food, Jake finally made contact with a resistance cell operating near the town of Reims. The French fighters, led by a woman known only as Marie, had been monitoring radio frequencies and had heard about the American pilot who had destroyed the German ammunition depot. "You are quite famous, mon ami," Marie told him as they shared a meager meal in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse. "The Germans have put a bounty of 10,000 marks on your head. They are very unhappy about their exploding depot." Jake managed a tired smile. "I aim to please." Marie's network had already arranged his extraction. A British Special Operations executive team would meet him at a predetermined rendezvous point in 2 days, from where he would be taken to a secret airfield and flown back to England. But the Germans weren't giving up easily. As Jake and his resistance escorts made their way toward the rendezvous, they found themselves pursued by an increasingly desperate enemy. Roadblocks appeared overnight, patrols searched every building and haystack, and collaborators offered substantial rewards for information about the American pilot. The final confrontation came at dawn on the 7th day, just 5 miles from the rendezvous point. Jake and 3 resistance fighters found themselves trapped in a small village as a German armored patrol closed in from 3 directions. With nowhere to run and limited ammunition, the situation appeared hopeless. But Jake hadn't survived this long to give up now. Using tactics learned in flight school, he coordinated the defense of the village like an aerial combat mission, positioning his limited forces for maximum effect while maintaining flexibility for rapid repositioning as circumstances changed. The battle lasted less than an hour, but when it was over, the German patrol had been defeated and Jake was finally within reach of safety. 2 hours later, he was aboard a British Lysander aircraft, flying through the pre-dawn darkness toward an airfield in southern England. As the French coast disappeared below him, Jake reflected on the extraordinary week that had transformed him from a young, relatively inexperienced pilot into a combat veteran and a hero. The ammunition depot mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, dealing a critical blow to German supply lines at a crucial moment in the war. But more importantly, Jake had discovered something about himself during those harrowing days behind enemy lines. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the ability to function effectively despite being terrified. He had learned that leadership wasn't about giving orders, it was about inspiring others to achieve their best when everything seemed impossible. When Jake finally returned to his squadron base 3 days later, he found himself something of a legend. Intelligence reports confirmed that his attack on the ammunition depot had been one of the most successful single-pilot missions of the entire war. The resulting supply shortage had forced the German division to abandon its defensive positions, allowing Allied forces to advance nearly 50 miles in less than a week. Colonel Harrison, his commanding officer, met him personally at the flight line. "Morrison, I've got some news for you. First, you're being promoted to captain, effective immediately. Second, you're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. And third, I've got a new mission for you this time, with proper support and a newer aircraft." Jake looked around the airfield at the rows of P-51 Mustangs, their engines warming up for the morning patrol. These were the newer D-model aircraft with the powerful Merlin engines, faster and more capable than his beloved Liberty Belle. "With respect, sir," Jake said, "I'd like to keep flying the older birds. There's something to be said for aircraft that can sneak in quietly and get the job done without all the fanfare." Colonel Harrison smiled. "I thought you might say that. There's an old P-51B in Hangar 3 that just came out of maintenance. The previous pilot named her Second Chance. I think that might be appropriate." As Jake walked toward the hangar to meet his new aircraft, he thought about the week that had changed his life forever. He had begun the mission as a young pilot eager to prove himself. He was ending it as a seasoned combat veteran who understood that true heroism wasn't about seeking glory, it was about doing whatever was necessary to protect the people and principles you believed in. The war was far from over, and there would be many more missions ahead. But Jake Morrison had learned something invaluable during his time behind enemy lines. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by the newest, most advanced weapons, but by determined individuals who refuse to give up, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Second Chance sat waiting in the hangar, her propeller gleaming in the morning sunlight, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. And Jake Morrison, now Captain Morrison, was ready to meet them head on.